Magpaint here with my latest table building project. This is a 4 by 5 foot kitchen table made with poplar wood. I built this table with a 10-foot slab of poplar wood from Wilson, North Carolina. This table will easily hold 6 people for breakfast, at dinner time, or supper time. It is a rustic table made not only with this popular slab, but I also used Florida Cypress poles for the legs and braces. I prefer natural legs because no matter what type of metal legs you have, it always looks industrial. This table is meant to be a rustic table. It is going to be donated to the Heartland Horse Equine Activities. That's a wonderful group of people up in Avon Park, Florida that help anyone who is physically, emotionally, or developmentally handicapped. And that can be a lot of people. They're going to have a fundraiser up there, and I decided to help them by building a table just for them. In this video, I'm going to go through every step I use to build the table. When it's over, I'm sure you'll agree with me that you do not have to be a woodworking expert with your own TV show or a special shop with all sorts of tools to build a very nice rustic table. So without any further ado, let's get on with making a 5-foot poplar kitchen table. The big day is here, when the poplar slab I'm going to use in my next table building project has arrived. Delivered by none other than Jeff Futch himself. He is the owner of Central Florida Live Edge Slabs up in Sebring. I greatly appreciate this service because at the present time I do not own a pickup. And by the way, Jeff is the person in the orange shirt. Jeff is doing a great thing for this project. He is donating this slab to me at no cost because I'm going to use the slab to build a table that I'm going to donate to an organization for a fundraiser they're holding up in Avon Park, Florida. They are known as the Heartland Horses Equine Activities. They use horses for children who are sick and veterans who are suffering from PTSD. Apparently, horses help people like that. Not only does Jeff deliver the wood, but he also helps bring it in to my high-tech woodworking shop in my garage. I appreciate that too because these slabs are quite heavy. And there it is, ready to go. Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate it greatly. And now I really can go to work. It is now time to get to work on prepping this slab to become a table. First, after inspecting it, I always like to double check the moisture content, even though it came from a trusted source like Jeff Futch. I like to be safe. So I used my moisture indicator to check it out, and it came through with flying colors. On this slab, I'm going to use 3 sanding processes. The first will be with my old faithful angle grinder, equipped with a 36 grit flap disc. That is a very aggressive disc, and it will easily remove any imperfections or marks that the wood picked up either in the sawmilling or in the shipping or wherever. It's also quick. Because it is so aggressive, you can go through a 10-foot slab like this in just a minute or two. Once we're done sanding the slab with the aggressive 36 grit flap disc, I'm going to move on and sand it again with my polisher grinder with an 80 grit pad. Now I'm getting to the second sanding phase on this particular slab. Before I get started, I like to remove any of the dust left by the angle grinder and then use my sander polisher with an 80 grit sanding disc on it. The purpose of this phase is to get rid of any scratches or marks that were left by the aggressive angle grinder. After this, I move on to the third and final sanding stage of this process using the orbital palm sander with the 80 grit disc. And now I will begin the third and final sanding process of this project. That will be with everybody's favorite, the orbital palm sander with an 80 grit disc on it. This process will bring out on this wood as much smoothness as needed when you are doing a float-on epoxy finish. You don't need a surface that's 2000 grit sandpaper smooth. When you put on this epoxy, it will cover up any minor imperfections left and create an incredibly smooth glass-like surface. After completing this sanding phase of the project, I will be moving on to the exciting phase of where we begin forming up the table. We are now at the stage of this table building project where we are going to cut this 10-foot slab into two pieces so that we can join the two together to make the tabletop. Making this cut is fairly simple. We don't need to worry about being real careful because we're going to trim the ends of the table after we put these two pieces together. All we want to do here is to cut this slab into two pieces so that we can get to work preparing the edges to be joined together with the magic of epoxy. If you notice, I don't even need to use my saw guide here because it's a simple cut, easy. We now have two pieces. Let's move on to the joining. We have reached the step in this process of building a 4x5 foot poplar table, starting out with that 10-foot slab that was delivered here recently. All the preliminary work's been done. We've sanded it off using the three methods of sanding that I use and cut it into the 10-foot slab. Our next step is to join these two pieces together to make the tabletop. Now, if you notice, these two edges are sort of rough. If we were going to join them together, it wouldn't be a very good table. So what we do here is we cut off the edges of the two inside pieces. Now, if you notice, there's still bark on this slab. I plan on making this table what they call a live edge table, or I call wild edge, where we leave bark on the outside. On both pieces, we want to select the best looking bark. Now we know right here on this one, this is not going to make it because they've got this flat portion here. On this board here, if you look at it, you'll see a gash here and a gash here. Just doesn't look right for a table that's going to be in someone's kitchen. So we've decided that the pieces we're going to cut off is this one, and that side on that one. And then we're going to join them together. So first, you minimize what you have to cut off here because you want to maximize what's here to give you as wide of a table as possible. Once we get these cut off even, which we're going to do next, then we're going to prepare these two pieces to be joined together in matrimony forever, never to be separated. There I'm going to show you how I use my poor man's jointer. You'll like this because you can make this just as good as someone with a big jointer. It's an amazing thing. And then I'm going to show you the way that I've developed to connect these two pieces using only epoxy. No nails, no screws, no biscuits, no pins. It works like magic. I don't want to claim it, but someone else might have done it, but I think it's a pretty good idea, which I'm going to show you. So right now, we're going to cut off this excess on each of these boards so we can prepare to make them up together. So let's get here. I am cutting off the unused portion of the bark side with my radial saw, and notice I'm using a very handy Quinn saw guide. It's very good because it will give you an accurate guide to cutting the wood. It locks onto the wood and is very handy. In this case, the wood is 2 inches thick, and so is the saw blade cutting the wood. Just keep the saw up against that guide and you will make a straight cut. As you get close to the end, it's a good idea to hold on to the piece that you're cutting off to keep it from falling and doing some damage. And there you have this slab with a beautiful cut, a straight cut, matter of fact. And now we're going to move on to cut the other piece. First, we're going to remove the saw guide and then move the other piece of wood off over to the front so the other piece of unused bark can be cut off. And here we have the second piece of this poplar that we're going to remove the outer edge of bark on the edge that we're going to join up with the other piece to make this table. Just as before, we use our faithful Quinn saw guide, lock it in place, and then begin to cut. Just keep that saw next to that guide and you will get a nice smooth cut. And before you know it, you'll be finishing up. And there you have it. Two pieces from this poplar slab that we can join together and create a tremendous kitchen table. We now have the two pieces with one edge cut off where they will mate up. After you finish cutting off the piece you're not going to use, you can now lay them out to get a good idea about how they're going to look. You can see here they fit much better now because I've cut them off, but they're not as good as they could be. I now have to use my poor man's joiner so we can attach these, and that's what we're going to do next. After we check out these cracks, we may have to fill these cracks with some resin to keep it from running out on the floor. We have one here and one here I'm going to check out, and that looks pretty good. So now we've got to the step where we're going to get serious in joining these two pieces together. We've finished cleaning it off with the 3 sanding methods, cut the slab in half, cut off the sides that we're not going to use, leaving the 2 best sides to be our wild edges. Next, I'm going to show you how I get a finish here just like a router would give you, but it's much easier and much less expensive. And then I'm going to show you my little secret about how I connect these boards with epoxy only. Let's get to it. These are the 2 boards that we're going to make the tabletop with. Before we can go further, I noticed that there are 2 cracks in each board that goes all the way through. So before we go forward with putting it together and all the other things that we do, I'm going to seal up these holes so that when we float on the final coat, the epoxy does not run out through these holes and end up on the floor rather than on top of the table. I have taped both of these cracks underneath, so hopefully when I pour some sealing epoxy in here, it'll stay and seal it up. When you put this epoxy in to seal up those cracks, you don't need to fill it up all the way. You just want to get enough into the crack so you seal up the bottom of it so the epoxy does not run through it. Both of these cracks have been taped from the bottom, and now I'm going to put in just a little bit of this magic epoxy. There's a crack here, I'll put a little in that one, and some over here in this crack. Again, we don't necessarily want to fill up the crack, but we want to make sure that enough gets on the bottom, it seals the bottom of the crack. If you notice, I put some in here and it's already run down into it. Sometimes these cracks can go long distances through the wood. If you get a little extra epoxy on this table, don't worry. Before we go forward, we will sand it off. Sometimes it takes a little while for it to run down in here, so you just wait on it, and as it goes down, add more. Again, all we want to do is get enough epoxy down in that crack so it goes against the tape that's on the bottom and it sets up and forms a seal on the bottom side so that when we pour on the epoxy won't run in and run out on the floor. We want it on the tabletop. Sometimes you'll notice bubbles forming on the crack. That means there's air in there coming up. We fill these cracks. We're gonna let it sit there for a day, sand this off, and get to work on our poor man's jointing techniques. The evidence has been removed that I filled up these cracks with epoxy to seal them up. Now we're ready to go ahead with the joining these two pieces together, and this is where I'm going to show you what I call poor man's joining technique. Essentially, I'm going to take a router and straighten these edges out here and then on the two pieces so they will butt up together. This drawing here shows what I'm going to be doing. This is a side view of the two pieces as they're coming together. From the top, you'll see that where I route along here to leave it smooth, those two will butt together. Then on the lower side down here, the lower half, I will ground this off at a 45-degree angle so that when you put these two pieces together, or you butt them together, you'll have a ridge in here that's shaped like a V, and that's where I put the epoxy. When the epoxy fills this up and runs over here a little, and a little bit will run down here, it will bond these two pieces together for life. I am now going to show you how I do it. That is the poor man's joiner technique. All you need is a router, a good straight edge, and a pair of glasses. Let's get to it. Here's the wood, here's the guide, there's the joiner, and here are the glasses. What we're going to do here is take the router and go all the way down, going in maybe 1/8 of an inch or less, getting 1 inch deep, getting a straight edge all the way. We want to make sure these are set straight because the router is set at 1 inch, and that's too much if you go too deep into the wood. All we're trying to do is just take a little off here to make it perfectly smooth all the way. Then we'll take the bottom off to accept the epoxy. Since this is a critical step, I would highly recommend that after you get the guide here, get it measured up and everything, to test both ends, here and there, to make sure it's the right distance in and they're uniform, because this is going to be a critical part of this operation. So let's check out my straight edge. Even though we think we have our straight edge set correctly, it's a good idea to check both ends before you do the whole thing to make sure it is set straight so that our tables will be straight when they are joined. Once we get those lined up, then we'll do the whole board. And now we have a nice straight line down there. Next, we're going to cut this back. When you're grinding this edge off this piece of the table, it's a good idea to stand it up on its end, and then it'll be easier to grind down to that 45-degree angle. So that's what we've done here. Just braced it up with some 2x4s. And now with my angle grinder, I'm going to grind this off to about a 45-degree angle all the way right up to this smooth portion. This side has been finished. You can see here, I smoothed this edge off with a router, and then this edge was taken down to about a 45-degree angle with the angle grinder. When you put these two pieces together, this gap here will be filled with epoxy. And then we will move on to the next exciting step of attaching the cedar pole legs to this table. That will be coming up shortly. I have fast forwarded this video to the point of where both of these pieces of wood have had the edges prepared for joining. I have them laying out now the way they're going to look. If you'll notice over here, underneath, you'll see this notch or groove here. This is where I'm going to put the epoxy to bond these two pieces together. We do that when this is flipped over. Before we flip these two pieces over so we can get started on making the table, we have to do a few things. First, we have to cover up this joint here. We do that with duct tape. First, we pull these together so that when we get the duct tape on, it'll make the duct tape more able to hold the epoxy in. This part here is not rocket science. The main thing we want to do here is keep the epoxy from coming up on the top of the table. If it does, we can handle it. We'll just grind it off. But why make extra work for yourself? Once the tape is on there, we're going to put the two braces on either end to keep this table together as we turn it over. I put plastic on these braces because the epoxy will get on the braces, and you do not want to have these 2x4 wood sticking to your table. So I wrap these braces in plastic to prevent them from sticking to the epoxy. We use some stiff clamps to brace this wood down because we want it to straighten out and be a nice level table. Now we have the clamp holding the two pieces together, and the two outside edges of the table are clamped down with braces. Now comes the fun part where I flip this over. Carefully. We are now here at the next step, and let me warn you, do not turn the table over the way I just did. It could be very dangerous for your health. Get somebody to help you. Okay, here we are getting ready to bond these two pieces together to make this beautiful Poplar kitchen table. We have the two pieces upside down. I've added some braces in here because it's very important to brace up the table to make sure it's all level and everything, because once you put this epoxy in this groove, it'll be like that forever. So I put all these braces on here to keep it straight. Now if you remember from before, these two pieces have been evened off here, and also I've notched out a 45-degree angle on both sides to make this notch where I'm going to put the epoxy. I've also done something else. Right here, I've added, I call it a caulking dam, about 2 or 3 inches on either side of the notch. The purpose of that is to allow me to put extra epoxy in this notch so to build it up a little bit. We want it to run over, but we don't want it to run over on the floor. So I put this in here to block it. I call it the caulking dam. Then also another tip, when I start this, it's a good idea to only put about this much epoxy in the bottom here so it seals up the bottom before you pour in all of the epoxy, because sometimes when you put in large pours of epoxy, it'll have a tendency to crack, and we don't want that to happen. So this table is ready to go. I'm going to add this small layer in here, and if everything works out just fine, you pour in this epoxy and there will be no epoxy dripping on the bottom. That's because I taped it up, so surely it won't leak. So without any further ado, let's join these two pieces of wood into eternal matrimony so they will provide someone a table for a long time. Here is the epoxy I already have mixed up, and I put a little color in it this time because if it does show up through that crack or even leak through, I would like it to be a shade that's close to the color of the wood. First of all, you cross your fingers and then you start pouring this in. And say, please, Lord, don't let it leak. When you pour it in the notches, it'll run underneath these braces here, so you don't need to worry about that. Whenever you're doing this, if you begin to hear something that sounds like drops of rain on your roof, that means it's leaking down onto the floor. So let's hope that doesn't happen. Adding more here. I don't hear any drips on the bottom, so it must be working. So right now I've got about this much epoxy into this notch down here. All you have to do is wait a few hours and then finish it off and bring it out to your caulking dam. And when you do that, those two boards will be bonded together forever. And here we are, ready to finish up this crack pour that I started yesterday. This is the crack that will join these two pieces together forever with this epoxy that we're putting in here. Previously, I put a little bit down to the bottom to seal it up, just to check for holes that may be in the tape that I put on there, and luckily there weren't any big holes in it. And also, if you put too thick of this epoxy at one time, it could crack. We don't want that to happen, so now we're going to finish it off. Carefully pouring some in here to bring it right up to the top and bring it out to my caulking dam. This is the magic part, because once this epoxy sets up in here, this wood is not going anywhere. At this point, we don't worry about running it over because I have the white caulking dams out there. Matter of fact, I'm going to fill it up anyway because I want to add some extra holding power to this resin. Pardon me, epoxy. Same thing. I will continue adding epoxy until I fill this up to here, to this caulking dam, and then I'm going to brush on epoxy all over the bottom and give it a brush on coat to seal the bottom of this table. The caulking dam is full, and now I am putting a coat of brushed on epoxy on what will be the bottom of this table. I do this strictly to seal it up. This is natural wood, hadn't been treated or anything, so I'm treating it with a coat of brush on epoxy to seal it up from the bottom and keep it safe from what might attack wood in the house, natural wood. I'm going to finish painting on this coat later. Then I'm going to let this sit for 3 or 4 days so this can set up and this table will stay in the shape that it is now. While this is sitting here curing, Then it's time to go to work on the legs. On my tables, I prefer to use cypress poles for legs. Number one, I do not like to use metal legs on these rustic tables. It makes them look like industrial tables. So I like to use the natural thing. Good, strong cypress poles like this one. I've selected these four here. They're about 5.5 inches in diameter. They still have the bark on them, but I use these because they add to the ambiance of the table, being a rustic table. While this is setting up, I'm going to have to remove the bark off these legs, and then we very carefully cut them to 29 inches. The surface of this table is going to be 30 inches tall, a standard height for tables. I'm going to cut these 29 inches because the thickness of this table is 2 inches. I'm going to sink these into this table 1 inch. So that'll leave 29 inches here and an inch here to give us a finished height of 30 inches. It is very important when you cut these table legs to make them exactly the same length, because otherwise we'll either have a wobbly table or a table that's not level. And you don't want someone to come into the kitchen and set a cup of hot coffee on there and it runs over on their lap. So that's why it's so important to cut these things level. Then we remove the bark, sink the holes in the table bottom, which we'll do after this sets up. Then we will attach these to the table, flip the table over, and then finish the top with 3 poured on coats of beautiful clear epoxy. So let's get to the fun of preparing our table legs. It is now time to take the legs of this table, position them in the spot you think they'll look best. The legs are different, so you might want to put the leg in a certain place to give the table a certain look. After you put them in position, check them out. If it looks good, mark them and number them, because these legs will be coming off and going back on several times during this process, and you want to get the legs back to where they're supposed to be, because it's very important to the look of the table. Also, if you notice, the caulking dam is still there on the bottom of the table. That's what we used to dam up the epoxy when we were joining the two pieces. I like to take that caulking off because even though it's under the table and most people won't see it, you never know when someone may get under there and wonder, what is that caulking doing on the bottom side of the table? So I like to just get rid of it with my handy angle grinder, and no one will be the wiser. And then we can move on to attaching the legs. Here I am finishing up removing the caulking dam. You get this cleaned up, and then next will be sinking the receptors that will accept the legs into this table. These receptor holes will go down 1 inch deep and 1 inch in diameter larger than the legs. As you can see, whenever you're routing, make sure you wear plenty of protection. As soon as all the receptor holes have been cut into the tabletop, you can go ahead and place the 4 legs into their respective hole. It's very important that they were marked along with the legs. Once you get the legs in there, it's a good idea to take the level and check them out. If these legs were not cut exactly the same, you're going to have a table that won't be level, and you don't want that. Once that's done, you're ready to start pouring the resin. These receptor holes should be about 1 inch in diameter larger than the legs. This gives you plenty of room to pour the epoxy into the receptor hole. You will also notice that I will slightly tip the leg over so that epoxy can run underneath the leg and get a good contact with that tabletop. You'll go around to each of the 4 legs and fill them up, and more than likely you'll have to do it twice or maybe 3 times because that epoxy will settle out through the wood. Sometimes you may have to come back the next morning and do a second pour because it'll settle a little bit. Once you get these legs epoxied in, they're going to be there forever. I think about the only way you can get them off is with a sledgehammer or a chainsaw. Once you finish this, we need to move on to designing your braces for these legs. These braces that I put on my tables are more for looks than function. They add sort of a quaint look to the table. To design your own legs is easy. You just take a square and a survey stake, set the survey stake at the angle you want it to be and mark it. That will be your pattern for setting your miter saw. You can also use it to see how your braces are going to look. And if you notice, you can make them any angle you want. You can make them higher or lower or whatever. That's the great thing about doing a project like this. It's up to your own imagination how you want to do it. Once you get your template marked so that you know what the angles are, the next step is to remove the bark from these braces and prepare them for attachment to the table and the legs. The legs and leg braces have been attached to the bottom of the table. It is time now to remove the table braces that held the 2 pieces together of the table while we were attaching it. After you get the braces off, it's a good idea to clean up the bottom of the table with your handy angle grinder. Then it is time to move on to applying 2 brushed on coats on the legs and leg braces of the table. You put on 1 coat, wait 24 hours, then put on the next. After that's done, you want to add a complete coat of epoxy to the bottom of the table. The purpose of this is to seal up the wood on the bottom and to help make that table last forever. After we finish that, on the bottom, it's time to flip the table over. We need to remove that duct tape that I used to seal up the angles when I bonded the tables together. I like to trim off about 1 inch off of each end of the table to make it nice and smooth. Also cut off the corners, about 4 inches worth, to make it easy to get around the table. The table is now ready to receive epoxy on the top. 2 seal coats are first. Before I apply any epoxy to the top of the table, I put plastic underneath it to protect the floor. Otherwise, we'd have a buildup of epoxy. I also put blocks under each leg of 2x4 to raise it up above the level of where any epoxy that's dripping off the top won't get onto the legs. Once that's done, I apply 2 base coats on this tabletop with a paintbrush. The purpose of this is to seal the table so that when you put on the float-on coats of epoxy, you will reduce the number of bubbles that come up and cause those unsightly moon crater-looking eruptions on your beautiful table. 2 base coats does a good job of reducing that problem. And now it's time to move on to the exciting phase of this table project of pouring on the epoxy. We are now at the final stage of this table building project, and that is applying the 3 float-on coats of epoxy. You just pour it on from a bucket in small streams. That makes it go further. You don't use any brushes, scrapers, or whatever to spread this out. You let nature do it all by itself. This will give you that fine glass-like finish you're looking for. You want to make sure that the entire table gets completely covered with epoxy. This goes down in 3 coats, and you let each coat dry for 1 day until you put the next coat on. Once you're finished, the only thing left are the drips. Those are easily removed with your angle grinder. Once you grind off all those drips, you are ready to sit back and enjoy your table.